This Notebook LM video dives into the wild accusations early Christians faced in the Roman Empire, including cannibalism, incest, orgies, and atheism. In response, Christians painted pagan gods as corrupt and their festivals as immoral, while also charging the Gnostics with immorality. These sensational claims were a common tactic to discredit rivals.
Today, we are diving into one of the wildest smear campaigns in history. We're talking about the absolutely shocking things people in the Roman Empire said about the first Christians. And I mean shocking. Charges like cannibalism, incest, even atheism. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? So let's get into it and figure out what was really going on. You have to understand, for the first 300 years or so, Christians weren't just seen as some quirky new religion. To a lot of folks in the Roman world, they were part of a weird, secretive, and frankly, dangerous cult, a superstition that people thought could tear society apart.
So imagine walking through your town and seeing a notice like this nailed to a post. Now, this poster isn't an actual artifact, but it perfectly captures the vibe at the time. There was real hostility. Christians were seen as this threat that had to be stamped out. But why? What in the world were they supposedly doing?
Okay, just look at this list. It's totally bizarre. Cannibalism, incest, and get this, atheism? These weren't just small complaints, you know? These were accusations designed to paint Christians as absolute monsters, as enemies of the entire human race. And that really sets up the big mystery for us. Where did these insane ideas even come from? And could any of them actually be true?
All right, so let's put on our detective hats and break these charges down one by one. Because what you're about to see is that a lot of the most horrifying accusations were really just born from huge misunderstandings of what Christians were actually saying and doing behind closed doors.
So, let's start with the big one, cannibalism. This is a classic case of a rumor just spiraling out of control. Outsiders would hear these whispers about Christians getting together in secret to eat someone's body and drink their blood. I mean, without any context, you can kind of see how that would sound, well, terrifying. But of course, they were talking about the bread and wine of the Eucharist, a total misinterpretation. And you see the exact same thing happen with the incest charge. Christians would call each other brother and sister because they saw themselves as a new spiritual family, and they'd hold these gatherings called agapes, which literally translates to love feasts. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a suspicious Roman neighbor. You hear about secret meetings where brothers and sisters are having love feasts. Yeah, their imaginations just ran wild, and suddenly you've got these crazy rumors of orgies. Now, the atheism charge, that one might sound the weirdest to us today. But from a Roman point of view, it actually made a twisted kind of sense. The Roman world was full of gods, and they all had temples and statues. Religion was something you could see and touch. Christians, on the other hand, no statues. They said all those other gods were fake, and they worshipped a single, invisible God. So to a Roman, if you reject all the gods we know exist, what are you? You're an atheist. But here's the twist. While most of these charges were just wild misunderstandings, there was one accusation that was actually true: disruption of business. You see, as more and more people converted to Christianity, they stopped buying things like sacrificial animals and little idols for the pagan temples. And that started to hurt the bottom line of a whole religious industry. And that, right there, created some very real and very powerful enemies.
So we've seen how pagans created this monstrous picture of Christians. But, and this is super important, it would be a huge mistake to think this was a one-way street. Christians were more than capable of firing back with the exact same kinds of attacks against their opponents. Which brings us to the ancient art of polemics.
The key word here is polemics. And we're not talking about a friendly debate, okay? This was basically verbal warfare. The whole point was to completely destroy your opponent's reputation, to paint them as evil, immoral, and dangerous. It was a tool to create a strong us by making a monstrous them.
And just look at this, it's almost a perfect mirror image. Pagans accuse Christians of secret, immoral rituals. Christians turn right around and point to pagan festivals as nothing but drunken orgies. Pagans accuse Christians of being immoral. Christian writers fire back and say, oh really? Your gods are literally adulterers, liars, and murderers. Everybody was using this as a weapon. But this weapon wasn't just used to fight outsiders. It was also an incredibly powerful tool for policing the lines inside the Christian community. When the mainstream Christian leaders wanted to discredit other Christian groups they thought were heretics, like the Gnostics, guess what they did? They pulled out the exact same playbook.
The accusations got laser-focused on sex and morality. Church leaders who were basically professional heresy hunters wrote these scathing attacks claiming that certain Gnostic groups practiced all sorts of wild stuff. They argued that these Gnostics believed the spirit was pure, so it didn't matter what you did with your body, and their opponents claimed that was just a convenient excuse for debauchery.
So you've got accusations flying everywhere. Pagans against Christians, Christians against pagans, and even Christians against other Christians. It's a total mess. So what do modern historians make of all this? What's the final verdict, especially on those claims about the so-called heretical Gnostics?
Well, the scholarly consensus today is pretty clear. The overwhelming majority of these accusations were just propaganda. When we actually look at the Gnostics' own writings, the stuff they themselves wrote, like the text found at Nag Hammadi, we find almost nothing to back up these wild claims. In fact, a lot of Gnostic texts preach the exact opposite, a super strict, ascetic lifestyle. So those charges weren't about recording history. They were a weapon to enforce one version of Christianity as the right one. So when you boil it all down, these crazy accusations served a very powerful social purpose. You can almost see it as a four-step playbook. Step 1, you use these charges to define your opponents as the other, totally different from us. Step 2, you claim moral superiority by painting them as corrupt. Step 3, this gives you a justification to exclude them or worse. And finally, step 4, it actually makes your own group stronger by uniting everyone against this common, supposedly monstrous enemy.
And that leaves us with one last, really important question. This whole playbook, defining, demonizing, and excluding a group by accusing them of being immoral, it was brutally effective 2,000 years ago. It's an incredibly powerful tool for shaping how people think. So the question for us is, where do we see that exact same pattern playing out in our own world today?